So let me just, and this is gonna, I hope it doesn't seem too tedious for Loyd, but let me just ask you some basic sort of truth claims type stuff, and let's just probe it a little bit.
Okay.
So when I was reading through your chapter, what came to my mind is the following. Let's just say that the Book of Mormon just appeared, and there were no claims about where it came from. Joseph Smith wasn't even in the picture. It was just this text that God dropped into a field, and it said, hey, this is a book by God, right? And you can either believe it or not. Then that's one way to start, right? Because it's just this book that who knows where it came from. It claims to come directly from God. Well, we can look at it and see if it makes sense or not, or if it makes us a better person, or if it enlarges our soul, if it, betters my life, if it tastes good, as you sort of say. But that's kind of not what happened. What happened is there was a person who lived in the material world named Joseph Smith. He made certain claims about the book, like that it was received from plates by an angel, that he translated it from the gift and power of God. He claimed that it was a history of, ancient Americans. So as soon as the narrative that provides the structure for the production of the book is laid out, and it's laid out in the material world, then all of a sudden those things are subject to sort of scrutiny from a logical and a scientific perspective. And so so an example would be, obviously with the Book of Mormon, because it's claiming to be a history of Native Americans, that's when DNA, of the Native Americans comes into play. That's when the anachronisms in the Book of Mormon come into play, because its whole framing about Joseph Smith's first vision and the narrative that he tells everyone about what God asked him to do, and then what he claims the angel told him to do, and then the way that he claimed to produce the book, all of that is grounded in material claims. And so if those claims seem plausible or reasonable, then, then they seem reasonable. But if they fly in the face of just basic science or basic reason, then it's fair game to ask, well, maybe it's the word of God, or maybe it's fiction and some dude made it up, right?
Yeah. So let me take this to a more simple version, and I kind of address this in a footnote. Mormon history is complex, and I think one of the big problems is we have 100 and so years of the church trying to simplify it in ways that don't, I think, really touch on how complex it is. And so I want to go back to a comment you made in the previous podcast with Patrick and Brian, and you said something effective. Either Joseph Smith in the Sacred Grove saw God, or he didn't. And I'm not sure exactly how you can, right? What is it? Well, let me phrase. When you're talking about that, right, you could talk about, what does it mean for Joseph to have seen God and all these sorts of things. So let's say you had a video camera was set up there, and you saw Joseph actually looking up at two beings and, floating above him and talking to them. That would still, it doesn't mean that you spoke to God, right? Who are these two beings, right? How would you know that these two beings are God, right? You're like, hey, let's do a scientific test and let's measure your God energy coming out of you or something. No, right? The only way that you can say, hey, these two beings are God is spiritually. Like you feel like, hey, there's something divine about what they're telling Joseph Smith or something. Now, on the other hand, let's say you had that camera there and you just look up and there's Joseph just looking into the sky, or Joseph passed out on the floor, right? Does that then say he didn't see God, right? And so it becomes a lot more complex when we're talking about this. And now bringing it to the Book of Mormon, right? As soon as we're talking about angels, as soon as we're talking about translating by the power of God, right? We're bringing in a spiritual realm, a spiritual way of looking at things. And I don't think historians have done quite the best job of really fleshing out what this all means. In my own opinion, Joseph Smith wrote the book. This is purely a 19th century text. Joseph Smith was an incredible, brilliant genius who had a knowledge of the Bible and that few people have, and was able to just, write down this text, something he probably been practicing, telling his family over the years. And yet, right. And so in my view, look, yes, it makes complete sense to say that this is a complete fiction. Now, whether or not Joseph believed he had plates is really far more complex. I think, again, the church's narrative has simplified it too much. But whether or not it is, again, the word of God it really just comes down to, when you read the text, do you feel moved by it, right? When you read, for me, when I read about Ammon's mission to the Lamanites, right, and this act of love and service, I feel empowered by it. And to me, that's when I say the Book of Mormon is the word of God, that's what I'm referring to. And I think that's what most Latter-day Saints are actually referring to. And so, yeah, there's these certain historical claims tied into it, but I think they're far more messier. And in the end, we might be able to say, yes, Joseph Smith did not actually have golden plates in his possession, but it still leaves the question completely over whether or not the text he produced was inspired, whether or not it was God's involved in it in some way.
So let me just really quickly, Loyd. So your view is that Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon, that there were no gold plates delivered by an angel, that it's not, in fact, an ancient record of Native Americans.
Correct.
And the Book of Abraham was not written by Abraham originally, that it's not.
No, in my view, is Joseph had a knowledge of the antiquities of Freemasonry, saw these papyrus, saw the facsimile, connected the two, but I think Joseph sincerely believed he was producing reproducing, right, translating an ancient text.
Yes.
Okay, good. And so do you and I'm just curious now. So when you look at the Mormon Church, do you view this as like the one true church, or, exclusive priesthood authority?
Come on, John, you're doing what you always do, which is
I know.
Get back to the meta issue here.
No, we will. I'm just curious to understand Loyd's frame, because I think that's important.
I think it is as well.
I think it's fair to ask. It's important. I think it's fair to ask. I just hate to poison the well for further discussion with others and whatnot. But I don't like the term atheist, but if theism is defined traditionally, then I'm not a theist, I guess. And so, but at the same time, I still feel moved. I still feel empowered by the Book of Mormon, by Joseph's teachings, and even by some church leaders. I remember there was a talk Thomas Smith-Monson gave years ago about, like, have I done any good? And I remember being incredibly powerfully moved by that. However, but I think in that way there is a prophetic authority speaking to me. But
okay. No, I appreciate you being honest and vulnerable, Loyd, and I'm not trying to trap you. I do think I think the words you said 5-10 minutes ago, it's important for our listeners, as we're thinking about that, to understand where you're coming from personally, because the words mean very different things, knowing where you stand with the Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham, and the church overall, than if the listeners were thinking that you thought it was a divinely transcribed,
No, I agree, right? So when I say I feel God speaking to me through the Book of Mormon, there's, some might say, there's a bearded man up on Kolob, right, that's somehow been involved with this text, that I'm affirming that. But I just don't care about that.
Okay.
I care about if this text, if I read it, if I feel moved to treat others differently.
No, I get it. And I still feel moved by Mormonism and by the Book of Mormon in many, many ways. Bert, I want to get you in, but I just want to ask one follow-up question, Loyd. So I get, just like when I read, East of Eden by Jonathan Steinbeck, or Rumi, there's all sorts of fiction or poetry or prose that moves me, right? That makes me want to be a better person, right? So I get that, and I still feel moved when I hear the Mormon Tabernacle Choir sing, or even when I hear the Right General Conference talk. So I get this idea that there's inspiration that can be found in or out of Mormonism, in or out of Mormon scripture, or even that Mormon scripture in particular can be uniquely powerful. So I get that. What I am trying to get your sense of understanding, what's wrong with a Mormon who says, yeah, there may or may not be power in these words, but for me, and I'm not saying me, I'm speaking on behalf of other people, it can't be, to call it the word of God. You know, when missionaries find investigators, they tell a story, and the basic story is, a lot of times man thinks that they're left alone on this earth, but really God's speaking to man, and God's speaking to man through these prophets. And these prophets are really special because they get a type of conversation with God that the rest of us don't. And so when I'm sad or depressed or lost, I can't really talk to God as much as I'd like, but this other guy had that really direct talk, and he can help me understand God's will better. And so an investigator is like, well, I'm interested because there's someone who's able to get more from God than I am. I'm all ears. And so we say, yes, there was this guy named Joseph, and he was able to talk to God in a way that you're not. He was able to get these plates and the angels and the scripture, and it was translated about an ancient civilization. And all of a sudden, when people are either converted to the church or they're in primary and they hear the narrative, what they're being sold is not, hey, the words in here will make you happy. They're being sold on a specific historical narrative, and that's what makes them agree to be a part of it, right? It's that founding narrative that then they go, oh, well, if that really happened, if that happened the way that I was told, then I'm interested. And so in some sense, Loyd, I totally, even personally, feel the same way you do about the power of the scriptures. What's problematic to me about what you're sort of putting down as an approach is that it feels like there's so many people that are sold on that literal narrative, and that narrative, if it's not what it says it is, then people are really being deceived, right?
All right, so let me respond to 2 points. One is, and they'll bridge together, as you'll see. I think, I've recently heard Elder Oaks make this claim, and this is something that like Dan Pearson always claim. They'll say like the church is not a social club, and when I hear that, I get like frustrated because I think they fundamentally miss something that Joseph Smith understood, and is that religion really is a social club. Religion without community to me makes no sense, right? You need a sense of community. So there's a sense of community that's incredibly important. And that's something I realized on my mission is, in the end, when people join the church, they weren't joining it because of these arguments and claims and whatnot. They're joining it because they've wanted and needed and felt a sense of community, right? When they get baptized, they get up and they look around, and their primary thought, at least as my experience was, it wasn't like, oh, I'm free of sin. It's, I am with these people, right? I am a part of this community. So
even when you're confirmed a member of the community.
Yes.
Even before the Holy Ghost.
Right? So, I mean, baptism at the heart of it is initiation into community. In fact, all of our sacraments, right, whether it's the sacrament, baptism, confirmation, to temple, it's all about being a part of a community, initiating and affirming your loyalty to this community, right? So that's one part. And the second part is, I think, we fail to recognize the importance of myth in our lives. I recently finished watching HBO's Leftovers. If you haven't seen it, it's a brilliant show. Yeah, and it's really, the last 2 seasons are really just exploring this notion of myth and how we need myth in our lives to kind of not just center ourselves or to find meaning, but just to exist. We always need myth in our lives. And I think one thing that strengthens a community is myth, right? When you have a story that you can all unite behind. And so, and myth is interesting because myth, when you talk about whether or not myth actually happened, is, I think, the wrong way to talk about myth. It's rather, is myth something that is true to yourself, right? So for example, I completely and positive 100% that there were not two naked people running around in the garden talking to snakes and eating fruit. Like there weren't. Like there was no Adam and Eve, and yet it makes complete sense to me to talk about my ancestors, Adam and Eve, and that's where we came from, right? Because this is a story that helps me understand who I am, helps situate myself in the world. And so I think ultimately when missionaries are going out, yes, are they selling a myth? I don't really think it's selling or like convincing or conning someone into a myth, but it's rather sharing a myth with someone. And some people might believe it literally, some people might believe it symbolically, but in the end, it's here's a story that is the basis of our community. Do you want to be a part of this community? And so then I don't think about selling, right? And some people might come to realize, I think some people might sell that myth too hard and ground it too hard in that myth. And some might try to dismiss it too much, but I don't think you can talk about the religious community without this myth that kind of unites everyone together.
Yeah, and I'll just, Bert, I'm going to turn it over to you, but I'll just say three things. The first is I agree that community is essential. I love it. I love the Mormon community and I miss it. I agree that myth is essential. I think that the book Sapiens makes a powerful case that myth is the defining characteristic or feature of the Homo sapien experience, and it's what's made us in so many ways great. But I come back to this idea that when missionaries, when a little 8-year-old is invited to get baptized, when a 25-year-old convert is invited to get baptized, they're not told there's this great community with these great myths that have these words that are going to really make you better. What they're told is this guy talked to God, got plates. The scriptures were translated. They are a historical record of ancient people. God keeps speaking to these prophets literally, and if you follow these men, you're literally following God. And so that's just a very different thing. And so if the day that missionaries and the general authorities stop overstating what the church is, I think is the moment that so many critics shut up. But as long as they continue to claim that the Book of Mormon is scripture, historical, is a historical book, comes from God, came from plates, came from an angel, that this is the one true church, that prophets do speak to God in some way that humans don't, then people are fundamentally being misled on a very large scale.
So two responses. I agree and disagree. So I agree in the sense of that I think the church is overplaying the literalness of its myth, but imagine the missionaries going out knocking on doors saying, hey, let me tell you about our myth, right? And our myth, which may or may not be true, is this. And our myth, like here's our story. Now, whether or not it's actually true, that's not how myth works, right? Myth isn't told as myth. Myth is just told, right? And it's a story. You don't say here's a story that we have to share with you, but it's rather here is who we are as a community. Here is how our community came about. And so I think it'd be silly for missionaries to go out and say here is a myth we have for you, rather than just here is our story.
Plus, they don't think of it that way themselves. I don't think the church leaders think of it themselves. I think there is an age and a stage development that doesn't let you entertain it. And I don't think it's necessarily bad for the 8-year-old or even in the early 20s person to do it. And I see lots of wonderful people in my ward functioning very well, still in that thing. And so I don't want to really rip it. And certainly it gives a lot of the power to the church when it's able to state them this way. So I always worry, John, when you say that they were deceived, or in that great email that we got, or the Facebook message from Tracy today, I was on a mission and I was lying about polygamy. That always involves a deceiver and deceitful intent, lying and lying intent. And so those words are what get me in this. I want to have people be able to come to this richer embrace of myth and recognizing their myths just the way they recognize other religions have myths. And America has myths, and every country and every family has stories that are the orienting stories. I want to let people get to that on their own without this heavy thing like they were lied to.
Okay, so I appreciate that, and let me
Bert's
just
got to talk eventually.
I'll respond to that, and then Bert will turn it over. So or at least for this part. So Dan, I don't believe that Thomas S. Monson or Dallin H. Oakes or Bednar are sitting there thinking the church is a fraud, the Book of Mormon's a fraud, so I'm going to lie to everybody and fool them, right? I do think there's a chance that Joseph Smith did that. I do think there's a chance that Joseph Smith authored the Book of Mormon as fiction, either in and of by himself or with others, and tried to pass it off as more than it was, and in that way deceived people. So I do think there's a high probability that there was an original fraud or deception. But reasonable people can disagree about that. But I think
I hope I'm one of them. Yeah. Yeah. I'm reasonable. I hope.
But if we're all sitting here saying, yeah, the evidence pretty much shows the Book of Abraham is not what Joseph claimed, the Book of Mormon is not what it claims to be, because all science pretty much shows that it's not, then if we just don't speak up about it, and then we allow that little 8-year-old kid to get baptized with the teaching and the understanding that the literal narrative is true. We let those converts join the church with the understanding that the literal narrative is true. All those seminary students making important life decisions about who to marry, when to marry, where to go to college, whether to serve a mission, whether to give 10% of your income. All of a sudden the stakes get very high because people are making major life decisions based on a literal narrative that they held before they had the chance or even the tools to get a more mythical or stage 4, stage 5 understanding. And then it gets really serious if a young woman is turning down college or a graduate degree or a professional career because she believed in the literal narrative. Or a young gay or lesbian Mormon becomes suicidal because they absorb the negative LGBT messages within Mormonism because they believe the literal narrative. And all of a sudden, this literal narrative becomes the chains that bind people to a set of very important life decisions that they probably would have made very differently if they had been told when they were 16 or 14 or 12, okay, let me just be honest with you, okay? Joseph didn't really talk to an angel, and there weren't really golden plates, and Thomas S. Monson doesn't really have any access to God that's better than you, 12-year-old. And these things that we teach didn't really happen, but they're just stories that you can consider, and the advice that the prophets and apostles give are just their best ideas or recommendations. But in reality, they don't have any more truth than you necessarily or I. And so as you're 12 and 14 and 16 and 18 and 21, yeah, you can take those things into consideration, but don't take them as fact. Don't take them as truth, because they're not true. They're mythical, and they're people just doing the best they can. And these things work for some, but they don't work for others. And I'm just saying this literal narrative binds people to paths that can be, destructive or harming, or at least perceived as being misleading for people for whom the narrative doesn't work out. So that's my reaction to what you're saying. Bert, why don't you jump in? I'm sorry I haven't given you more time to talk so far.
Oh, no problem at all. As somebody who studies literature rather than philosophy, this matters a lot to me. And I don't pretend to speak with any expertise when it comes to Mormon history or anything like that. I think I know just as much as anybody that has looked into these things, but I'm not an expert. I haven't spent 5 years getting a PhD in American religious history and so on and so forth. But when we talk about myth, it's something that is very important to what I do study, and I think that it does matter. So Loyd in his essay refers to Wittgenstein's formulation of a language game, Sprachspiel. And the thing about a game is it sounds, and I am not imputing to Loyd any interpretation of these terms. I'm just pointing to the fact that this concept is brought up in his essay. And if he wants to clarify anything, he's more than welcome to. But games can be benign, or they can be lethal. And we could come up with lots of examples of this. One of my favorites is in the 14th century poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where the Green Knight shows up at the Christmas feast in King Arthur's court and said, let's play a beheading game. Any knight in here can take one swing at me, and then I'll be back in 1 year to take my swing at them. And so Sir Gawain stands up, takes a chop, beheads the knight, the Green Knight. The Green Knight picks up his head and says, I'll be back in a year. And so Sir Gawain spends that full year stressing and under tremendous anxiety because he has signed up for a game that he didn't know the rules to necessarily. And I think what you're referring to, John, is that Mormonism is at its base a myth or a language game. I think that Dan and I and Loyd and even you would agree on that. But what you're coming from is the context of clinical psychology and life coaching and helping people whose lives have been destroyed as a result of playing this game, many of which didn't sign up for it in the first place. And so the way I feel is, yes.
You mean sign up knowingly with all the information?
Yeah, they didn't know the rules. And there are lots of examples that we could point to. How many people have gone to the temple committing to play by certain rules that they were never made aware of up to leading to the temple, but they have to agree, otherwise they won't be going on their mission, or they won't, or they will be canceling their wedding.
Covenant by ambush is my favorite phrase.
Yeah, covenant by ambush, right? Yeah. And if we want to talk about the literalness that the church hierarchy, and I'm not talking about just individuals, okay? I'm talking about the institutional dissemination of literature, church literature, whether it's in Sunday school manuals or in things like Preach My Gospel, missionary tracts, and so forth. I have experience editing books that use church editorial guides, meaning, okay, do you capitalize apostle, do lowercase high council, things like that. And in it, the church's current style guide, they specify that you shouldn't say golden plates, which is something that you just said, John. They say you should say gold plates. And I can't presume to know why they make that distinction. Maybe they just want uniformity, but the intent is irrelevant to me. The effect is that when you say golden plates, it suggests gold. When you say gold plates, it proclaims it. And so this is just one very small example of a broad literal mindset, which pervades, I would argue, the majority of active Latter-day Saints religious experience. And so my critique of Loyd's argument is not that I think he's wrong, it's that I think he's referring to the religious experience of a very small LDS minority. And that if you were to speak to a Latter-day Saint who bears testimony in fast and testimony meeting on the first Sunday, and they say, I know the Book of Mormon is the Word of God, and so forth. And then in the very next hour during Sunday school, when they are discussing the Book of Mormon, if anybody were to say, oh, when you said that you know the Book of Mormon is the Word of God, did you say it that way because you don't put any stock in the historicity of the Book of Mormon? And when you start speaking in that way, Sunday school becomes a hostile environment fairly quickly. And I think it's because most people there, even if they're making a conceptual mistake by conflating these categories, and they could come to a more complete understanding, the fact is that is where their understanding is at that time. Those are the rules of the game that they are playing by at that time. And when they have family members or whatever playing against those rules, they start to say foul and they penalize people. That's my basic take. I'm sorry, the dog is scratching. I've got to get rid of him. You'll excuse me a second, and I'll be right back. And continue.
So there have been several comments, lots of comments on the page. Maybe I'll just read a couple.
Yeah.
First of all, somebody jokes and says, it's Brian Whitney, that Loyd Ericson is the Keanu Reeves of Mormon studies.
Woo!
Wait, the Keanu Reeves of Mormon?
He means in looks. He means in looks and mannerisms, not intellectual capacity. And then he says Bert Fuller is the Matt Damon. So
Nice.
he's pegging Matt. I don't know who you and I are, Dan, but that's a fun point. Lots of different comments. So there's some criticisms of me that I'll read. One of them basically says, this is Rich, who says, push button, insert John's mantra.
I apologize for that.
We get it, John. Bert, I'm just reading some comments from our listeners. Okay. Rich writes, push button, insert John's mantra. We get it, John. You always make the same point. It's certainly a valid point. Just not sure why you are always triggered to make this point again and again and again and again. We get it. So Rich is sick of me making this point. I feel like my point's in context of our discussion, but you know, Bert's, he's saying he's sick of it. Brian Whitney writes, basically, this turned from a typical Mormon Matters episode, more abstract and philosophical, to a typical Mormon Stories episode, true, false, basing your life on misinformation. And Loyd, from you, in the past, when I've interviewed people and started talking about truth claims and eventually got onto this mantra, I've also sensed that you tire and get frustrated with these same lines of questions. So how do we move this conversation from a typical Mormon Stories interview to one where we actually shed new light or have new ground? Do you guys acknowledge that the point I and maybe Bert and I are making is valid?
Oh, I certainly think the point you're making is valid. You know, I guess what Bert's kind of highlighting is that the church over the years, and Christianity has done the same thing, right? This is one of D.C. Phillips' critiques, has almost created a new game by attempting to bridge these two together. But I think what that does is it shows that it's a game that the rules really don't make sense, right? So you're getting shoots and ladders and Russian roulette or something, and trying to say, okay, now let's make a game of shoots and ladders and bullets or something, and it's a game. If you try to play it out, this is what happens, right? Latter-day Saints are trying to play this game, and they realize the rules are in conflict with each other. They don't make sense, and then they basically, I'm done. I'm done playing this game. This game's stupid. It doesn't make sense to me anymore. Which reminded me of like a It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia episode or something. But for those of you who watch this show, I forget what the game's called. Anyways, but so I think you are highlighting this point, right? Is people this game. They're playing a game that you can't really play because the rules just don't make sense, because it's trying to mix rules together. And so they quit. They say, look, this game doesn't make sense. I'm out of here.
And you suffer for playing it.
Yeah, and you suffer because it's painful. Like there's some game, like if you ever played a game where the rules make no sense, it's painful because you have no idea what's going on. You don't know what to do because you find two rules in conflict with each other, and and you hope that, okay, the game makers have discovered this. You have to go online and find their additional rules to resolve these things, right? So this metaphor can go on and on. And so, yeah, so I do think you have a valid claim. And I think that, again, a part of the claim is the church itself has made a confusing set of rules by which the true is determined.
Mm-hmm.
But this emphasis, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, in response to what you just said, and in light of John's question, how do we move the conversation forward? My personal way of moving the conversation forward is not to attack the church directly. I think there is enough material out there that people can make their decisions one way or another. I think because the church is a living institution, it's not a thing of the past strictly, that people should continue to talk about current events surrounding the church and offering their opinions, absolutely. And within the context of apologetics, I feel like a lot of the critiques of quote unquote traditional apologetics have, in intellectual circles at least, been hacked, these lines of argument have been hackneyed and threadbare. We're bored with them, and we don't find much use in them. And so for me, the next fertile ground is to go after what I would call the liberal apologists, which I won't hijack our conversation to explain why. But what matters to me is that on the one hand, John, you have every right to address concerns which remain very present in the lives of thousands and thousands of people. And they would feel ripped off, I think, if once they started going through an experience that people have been going through for a long time, and then the voices out there that could help them say, oh, well, we don't want to talk about that anymore because we've been talking about that for a long time. I feel like, well, it's new to them, and it's nice to know. For me, for example, I stopped going to church a year ago, and I'm glad there are people still having these conversations. And on the other hand of what you were talking about, Loyd, I think that if we do want to talk about new ground and new area within how we discuss the religion within the church, more people have to do so despite risking being thought a little weird or a little, frankly, they have to risk job opportunities as well if they are academics. And if they really, my opinion is that if they really do care about their religion more than their job, then they will take those risks. I took that risk from my perspective. Maybe you can make that clear as well, but I think that you, Loyd, and you, Dan, have taken those risks. And again, you share your own perspective on this, but from my point of view, you've had to pay for that materially for doing so. And I commend you for it. So that's how I feel like we can move the conversation forward, is when more people take more risks. But.
That was wonderful. If I were to add, this isn't how to move the conversation forward, but I always want to make sure that this piece gets in there, just like some of my earlier stuff. But that's that pain, struggle, wrestle. Obviously, there's terrible extreme cases of suicidality or marriages that break up over these things and stuff like that. But for most people, at that right time in their life, they're going to get called onto a journey into greater depth or something. And if they are, and if they go on it after, some adjustment and some sort of grieving of the loss of innocence and the naivete that they, came to honestly, they're glad for these fights, John. And I think you don't always give credit to that as much. I'd say everybody at that retreat that we just had, even though it was very, very painful, wouldn't go back. The whole a pig satisfied versus a Socrates unsatisfied. I think we get that as human beings. So I just don't always want to say the 12-year-old, the 14-year-old, these younger things, these are ages and stages that are great. And honestly, the church is preaching to a center. And if you buy Fowler and any of his stats or Ken Wilber, now he's doing spiral dynamics and the different color schemes and all those sorts of things, we're looking at 60 to 70 to 80% of adults, that's where they're at. And I think that most of the general authorities are at that same sort of stage. I wish the ones that weren't would show more vulnerability, would show their own wrestles, would sort of model these things. But on the other hand, I can't call for them to simply go, hey, mythic.
Oh, and I forgot to mention, but this idea of myth, on the one hand, we have a defense of myth, but at least in the essay, an attack against fantasy. And, somebody that, again, is coming from literary studies, that's an unfair double standard. But.
So if I'm trying to tie this to the discussion about apologetics, let me lay out maybe a metaphor, and then see if we can use it to talk not only about traditional apologetics, but what I'm calling neo-apologetics, and maybe in that way try and advance the conversation a bit. So let's just say that the Mormon church in the 21st century is kind of like an automobile. It's an automobile that in many ways drives around. It gets people where it needs to go. Sometimes people have amazing experiences in it. It's a viable form of transportation. But there's some information about its safety record or its reliability that has been known for some time, that can occasionally lead to death or very unsatisfactory sort of experiences. And so no one's going to argue that lots of good times have been had in this car, that in many ways it's taken a lot of people to a lot of good places, but that for some time now, information has been available in the public domain that would let people know that occasionally using this car can be fatal, not because of external influences, but because of flaws in the car itself, right? And or sometimes it's got a safety or reliability record that can make it so it's going to break down or be unreliable in ways that can cost a lot of money and a lot of pain and a lot of time. So, and then let's just say that we now know that the manufacturers of the car have known about this information, these problems with it, for a long time, and have sort of punished people who have talked about these problems or have tried to hide the information so that people won't know about the flaws and instead just keep talking about how wonderful and amazing it is. Is that a metaphor that we can all sort of agree is a reasonable one to then use to talk about apologetics?
I think this goes back to your earlier claim about, people who suffer because of Mormonism, right? Who go through issues that they probably shouldn't have had to, and it goes back to this kind of thesis I was playing with about ecclesiastical or institutional authority and prophetic authority, and being an institution. Just being told I can. You guys can hear my breathing. Apparently, I don't know. Being an institution, the goal ends up being, right, any kind of institutional authority is always going to try to perpetuate itself, right? So what you're talking about, John, is risk analysis, right? Here we know there's a problem here. How do we, statistically, right, let's punch in all the numbers, clickety clacks, get our accountants in here and our anthropologists and everything, and let's figure out what is the way we need to go forward that's going to cause the least risk, right? Which is going to cause the least loss of membership and so on. And I think that's just one of the, it's one of the unfortunate and inevitable, I think, results of any institution, right? Especially when we have an institution that is so authoritative, right? It's because authority is always going to be trying to perpetuate itself, whereas prophetic authority is risky, right? Prophetic authority, right, is vulnerable. It recognizes losses might happen, and I won't go into politics, but you see this with political institutions, any kind of institution, right? The voice that wants to be authentic, try to create positive change, and the voices that want to maintain their authority because they feel like, hey, and I think church leaders authentically feel this way. Look, we are shepherds of this flock, and we have a God-given responsibility to protect them all we can. I think this is what drove Packer, right? A lot of people, as I tell people, like, Packer said a lot of horrible things, but I think he firmly believed, hey, I'm engaging in risk analysis there. I have a responsibility to take care of people, and this is what I think is the best thing to do to take care of people. But unfortunately, that part of that taking care of people always ends up including protecting the authority itself. So I think there's a lot of challenges there that any kind of religious institution is going to face because, as Doctrine and Covenants says, right? Any kind of, you give anyone a power, they're going to abuse it, and it's inevitable, I think.
Right. So in the analogy that I used, would it starts with this idea that there's this thing that exists that a lot of people are getting value from, but some people are having bad experiences, but other people are having good ones. Okay. And then it extends by saying there's some information that people don't have that's true and possibly really useful. And so there emerges these critics, right? That are, whether it's B.H. Roberts or Fawn Brody or Juanita Brooks or the September 6 or Leonard Arrington or whoever, that are like, hey, these car salesmen are sharing information that isn't the full story. And they know better, that the information is available to them, and they're selling, and this all gets all the way up to Mormon Think or Jeremy Runnels or Mormon Stories or whatever. so I'll ask Dan and Loyd, is it okay? Do the critics who are concerned about 21st century Mormonism, do they have credible and relevant information that they're expressing concerns about?
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
Loyd, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. And let's go with this car analogy. All right, let's assume, assuming that the information that they have, these cars being dangerous and harming some people, is true, right? So we know for a fact, this car's got a malfunction in its airbag, and so therefore, it might fire off in the middle of driving and kill someone.
Right.
Right. And so, but if they're asking the question, okay, how much, if to fix this problem makes it so the car is so expensive that nobody can own the car, right? Then the question comes into, right, yes, it's going to harm some people, but in order to remedy it, nobody's going to be able to have a car now, right? And I think that's the way that some church leaders are approaching this. Look, yes, there's problems here, but if we address these problems, it's going to make it so that the goodness that we have simply
the company goes away, right?
The company goes away.
That if we admit that there are flaws in the transmission or the airbag, if we admit that and if we talk openly about it, we'll have lawsuits for all the people that have been killed from it, and then they'll sue the church or they'll sue the car making company, and then the car company will disappear, and then no one will be able to benefit in these cars. And so instead, we need to not talk about the problems and maybe even punish those who talk about them so that as many people as possible can enjoy the cars. Is that kind of what we're saying?
I think that's definitely part of what's going on, yeah.
Okay. And so critics emerge naturally saying, hey, there are these problems that the leaders aren't talking about. These people are getting hurt. Apologists emerge, and let's just say we're talking about Maxwell Institute or farms, right? The analogy of what they would do would be to say, for example, the ad hominem, which is, oh, those guys talking about the faulty transmission, they're gay, or they're adulterers, or they're liars, right? So that would be the ad hominem analogy. And I think we all agree that that's wrong, right? True?
Yes.
Yeah, yes.
And that's old Maxwell Institute.
Yeah.
Right.
The Maxwell Institute wasn't that way when I was there.
Yeah.
Right. Another thing they could do is they could say, oh no, the transmission isn't faulty. It's working exactly as it should. And let me invoke a bunch of scientific stuff that will basically claim that the transmission isn't faulty or the airbag isn't faulty. And they try and use science to convince people that there really isn't a problem when we know that there is one. That would be another form of apologetics that I think, Loyd, even you yourself would say that's not good. If there's that's not playing the right game, right? Because then you could measure how many deaths, you could measure how many times the transmission breaks down. And if the value of the car or the car company is based on something as trivial as whether or not the transmission works, then it could make people conclude that you shouldn't buy the car, you shouldn't invest in the company. And that's not the point. The point is that people have good experiences with the car, and that's what should be focused on. Is that kind of what you're saying, Loyd?
I'm not sure how far the car analogy plays into my piece, especially when, again, you're and this is one of the problems is you're assuming that the analogy is one-to-one with the car problem, right? You're assuming that it's obviously clear and this is indubitable that the church's airbags are faulty, right? So you're making an assumption there that I would say that some people at the Maxwell Institute and even with farms and others would say, no, you're actually misidentifying the problem itself. So I think there's a problem in the analogies. I think you're assuming too much and then carrying it on to this other thing. So yeah, so if we're assuming that yes, these things are absolutely false and etc., then some of that problem exists. But
and I think for John, he's not talking about whether it's false, but whether it's faulty. And as a result of it being faulty, people have accidents and people die. And if we didn't want to use the car analogy and take that too far, maybe we could use another vessel for transportation, which is a ship, which is what, LDS leaders and early Christian leaders were more than happy to use as the analogy or the metaphor for the church and this vessel. And it seems appropriate to me. And if we're going to talk at the level of metaphor and talk about the level of myth in order to defend Mormonism's claims, whether social or truth claims or whatever, then we also have to be able to talk about metaphor and so forth at a level that allows us to critique these things as well. Because I find metaphor and myth to be fairly amoral, and they can be used to bolster or to criticize certain claims. And in terms of what you're discussing, John, see, this is the problem I see, is that when people do tell the truth about certain things, I'm not saying in a general sense, but I think Greg Prince is a good example. He spoke at Salt Lake Public Library a couple weeks ago and spoke very eloquently. I think he's a very articulate and intelligent individual. And one, from what I can tell, is highly invested in the millennial generation sticking with it, as it were, moving into the leadership ranks and hopefully making a difference decades from now, after he's long gone. And so in that sense, I find what he's doing entirely selfless. He doesn't need to do it. He really is committed to the betterment of the community. And my question for him was, well, every time you write a book, it seems to encourage swaths of the population to leave, which I think is a natural result of telling truths, is that half the people will be offended by them and they will defect, and the other half will be unaffected because they base their commitment to the community on religious experience of the sort that Dan and Loyd are describing. And so if it is true that people stay in the community because of their religious experience, it seems to follow that when people like Greg Prince or whoever else write books, that despite Mike Quinn is another example, they have no intention to write books to get people out of the church, but the result is that many people leave the church after reading these books. Then I don't think that the people leaving can be faulted because they've confused categories, when the categories they have been taught and have been inculcated in their entire church education, whether through seminary, institute, BYU religious education, classes that they teach on Sunday or whatever, is completely geared towards the type of conceptual confusion that, if I understand Loyd correctly, he says we need to clear up. And I'm all for it. I'm all for cleaning that up. But the only way that I see us being able to clear that up is by attacking it openly, and you do so at great personal cost. Because even if the ship or the car or the vessel is faulty, and you point that out, there are powerful people that will not like you pointing that out. And you may suffer defamation, you may suffer an opportunity cost of material wealth that you might otherwise have had. You may suffer a lack of job security. You may suffer being associated with people that you don't particularly have in common, but because your criticisms are vaguely similar, you get bunched and grouped together. And so it's obviously an intractable problem, and nobody has the answer. It just seems that people are doing their best, and I think for some, a person's best is rather self-serving, and for others, a person's best is more self-sacrificing. But that has to be the judgment of every individual. It can't be stated broadly in a general sense.
Okay, I think I've come up with how the analogy works.
Okay.
Run with me here, right? So dealing with the car, right? And so say there's a car and there's a good reason to believe that that it might be faulty. Traditional apologetics would basically say, no, there's no fault in the car.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And
people die.
Yeah.
So people drive it and then die. Right.
That's right.
NeoApologetics is John wants to phrase it, even by Givens, Mason, even like with the church history department doing right now, or Maxwell Institute, they might say, look, yeah, there is faults, but as long as you only make right-hand turns driving this car, everything's going to be fine.
Yeah.
And some people are going to be like, wait, all right, that works out, but that's not what I bought the car for. I'm out. Right. Yeah. And me, I'm sitting back saying, well, what does this have to do with how comfortable the seats are? Right. And right? And if in terms of just like, if religion is just having a nice, comfortable seat, what does whether or not you're turning have to do with the comfort of the seat, right? Maybe we can adjust, fix this, or realize, cars are only meant to turn right, whatever. That's a whole other discussion.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with the bearing of the comfort of the seats here. So there's how I would play with the analogy.
Well, and the other thing I would say as well, to carry this forward, is that in my experience anyways, when a quote unquote neo-apologist will say, yes, there is a problem, but what you need to do is not focus on the problem, but on something else. And maybe a nice little piece here is Adam Miller a couple years ago posted about that Buddhist story of a man being shot with an arrow, but didn't know where it came from. And he said, well, don't focus on who shot you, focus on getting better or whatever. I forget the whole story.
Pulling
but
the arrow out, yeah.
Yeah. And so I find this to be a common rhetorical move among quote unquote neo-apologists, because they say, no, don't actually look at the problem. Look at how you can put a Band-Aid on the problem or something like that. And I don't find that particularly helpful, honestly. I recognize there's a risk in focusing on problems to the exclusion of what is good or what is beautiful in your life. But I don't feel comfortable this being a general strategy when saying, hey, there's a problem with the car, and I'm not going to go into depth what that problem is. That's not for you to know, but you can trust that, I'm somebody who spends my days thinking and reading and writing. I've looked at it, and the solution is just, was it don't turn right or only turn right?
Only make right hand turns.
Yeah, only make right. I'm not an ambi-turner, right?